half it's already done. You've done that work. You need to be getting, some of the first dollars.
Yeah. So again, I think it just goes back to your first initial point is really, but now we have a lot more context to this too. Really looking at yourself and what is it that you really need? What you think you might need might be more of a want, right? But looking and analyzing yourself in the game's progress so far in terms of the reach and what type of awareness it has created. Looking at those things are really going to help you move forward with these types of decisions, and whether you're about to make a good one or maybe not the best one.
Yeah. And it's, another thing to consider in all of this is, and it's to a greater or less extent, depends on the publisher, but there are a lot of publishers out there who basically their business model is sort of riding on potential successes, watching if, among the ones they're in, so they may do publishing deals with multiple games. They watch them. One looks like it's going to be a success. Now they're investing in that one while they let all the others dangle on their own anyway. And you do want to watch out for that. And there are certain terms that you'll find in publishing contracts that sort of, point towards that. One thing that and this is somewhat rare to see, having, but frankly, I don't think this should be a term, or somewhat rare to. Sorry, apologies. Coughing. So this is somewhat. At least I've seen it quite commonly in publisher contracts where they have a term that allows them to terminate for convenience, and that can be called different things, but often it's called termination for convenience. Though you want to look at the substance, because you want to look for any term in the publishing contract that lets the publisher simply say, "We changed our mind. We're canceling the publishing contract." Those terms mean the publisher can entirely just, they basically have an option to publish you. They can speculate into the point. They can cut their losses at any moment. Now, again, I'm not saying that that's a killer if the publisher is otherwise good, because, again, a lot of really good publishers use bad contract terms like that. But it should give you some pause, and you should consider it, because it means that you have to look at whatever milestones they're paying you on and realize that they also have the option to simply midway through cut all funding. And you have to then treat every bit of future funding that you haven't yet received from them as speculative, as something they may or may not do depending on their own interests. And then one term that I would really watch out for, and is any term that sort of like basically there's a lot of things. I would watch out for any term that sort of like allows them to terminate for convenience and still retain the financial interest in the game's success. And that's more rare, I think. I think, a lot of good publishers wouldn't use something like that. But you definitely don't want that to be in there. If they're going to have a termination for convenience clause, it needs to be they terminate for convenience and that's the end of it. And, they're out, fine, and you're on your own. If they can terminate for convenience and then still collect money from you later, that's a clause to be very concerned about. You also probably don't want to do any, you don't want to do any deal where they're not like promising you that they will actually publish your game. I've seen some publishers approach devs about this where they say, well, we'll decide later, but they want to sort of sign the contract now, but they're not putting their name on it. That's something to watch out for. You want to look out for, and I would also say you also want to look out for any deal that doesn't require the publisher to commit something to it. For instance, and it can be any number of things, but if the publisher is not giving you development funds, they need to be, I think, guaranteeing some amount that they're going to spend on advertising and such. And there needs to be some guarantee somewhere in that contract that says they will do things that, are beneficial to you, whether it's giving you money or spending money on your behalf. And it needs to be pretty solid. Like they should be giving you a number. There should be a minimum marketing spend guarantee, in there that they will spend at minimum that amount. Because otherwise they're not really promising you anything. That's the thing. If it's a contract that doesn't give you any development funding and they don't promise any minimum marketing funding guaranteed, then they're effectively promising you nothing. And you're promising them a share of your sales because they talk about their mystery expertise in marketing and how good they do for games, but they're not promising you anything. There's actually nothing you're definitely getting from that contract. They can just ride it to see what's going to happen otherwise, speculate on it, and then jump in later and do something if they decide to. So that's a contract I'd be very wary from. If you hear, if you're looking there and there's no minimum guarantees, no minimum amount of spend they're doing. And then finally, I would also watch out for, you want to make sure that if they are guaranteeing you that they'll spend money on, say, marketing your game, that doesn't mean them just paying their own internal overhead cost and billing it to you as marketing. So, like them spend, you want to see that they're going to spend money out there in ways that are outside their company, not just like, oh yeah, well, we've got Tom and Sally in our marketing department, and they're going to like look at your game and do their magic. And then later you're going to see a bill that says, oh yeah, see, we spent $20,000 on marketing your game because we pay Tom and Sally their salaries, and that's $20,000, and we apportion that to your game. That's not real. That it really isn't. And that's not me saying that it's illegitimate for publishers to have some amount of sort of like directed activity, or even just like some or external contractors that they hire, or even just like staff that is definitely doing your thing that forms a small part of the total marketing expense. But if all they're really doing, all they're really doing is just assigning staff to work for you that they would have on staff anyway and be paying anyway, and that's the only thing they're doing, that's a concern. Again, they really haven't promised you anything at that point.
Yeah. So, well, there's definitely a lot of good publishers out there and everything. And not only that, there's probably a lot of good publishers too that have, good intent. Those are definitely still some things to look out for, or at least be aware of, which brings me into our next session as we start to close, is like lessons learned. So in light of everything you just shared there and earlier, what are like the best kinds of questions that devs should ask publishers when they receive an offer or when they see some of these types of things come up that you mentioned?
So, I think the best questions are going to get to how the publisher sees their role and how they do business, but you're not always going to be able to try. I mean, this is the thing. I don't think you can fully trust the answers you get. And that's not like a dig on anyone, but everyone who talks to you is being a salesman. They, more or less, I mean, the more honest ones will acknowledge they're doing it, right? If anyone's ever telling you their motives are entirely altruistic, then you really start doubting them at that point. Everyone's being a salesman. So you're going to ask them questions. I think observe how they answer and how they think of it. And I wouldn't ask like, well, what, I would try to sort of like go through scenarios with them and ask them how they'd approach it. But again, the answers you get may not be what actually happens. And you may not even be talking to the person who's the decision maker. If it's a larger publisher, the person you're talking to may not actually be in a position to make the final decision on a lot of things. So I would put my focus on digging into their past track record with games. Looking at the past games they published, like I mentioned earlier. I know I'm coming back to that, but I think that's what you can trust, is you can trust what they're doing for those games. And if they're released, how many reviews do you have? If they're unreleased, what are their wish lists doing? That's really the truth of what's going on and how they approach things.
Yeah, and I want to say, I think that's an amazing point, because this is just coming from me, from my perspective, in terms of like my understanding and knowledge, especially with marketing. For someone like me, let's say, asking questions, it might be very specific and related, and like you said, providing scenarios and seeing how they respond to that. But that won't always reveal some stuff. And again, to the point where if you're working with a big publisher, they might not know that, and you might never get an answer, or at least a very specific or direct answer to such a specific question. So again, even for someone out there that's more like me, that's like, hey, I have this really clear understanding. I think I could get the answers I'm looking for by being very specific here. That the point is that you're making is very applicable to anyone, regardless of your background or understanding of things. Is what's their track record? Like in some ways, to an extent, you're only as good as your last performance. So look at the last performances. If they've been really good, and these games are getting exposure from partnering with them, then that's clearly a good indicator that they're doing something right and whatnot. So I like that approach a lot.
And the other thing to all this is, in terms of like getting answers, is that the publishers, the people talking at publishers, are salesmen, and they're also plugged into what indie devs are talking about and what they're concerned about. And they're responding to that, and language is phrased in a way to alleviate that in a way that may not reflect the substance. And one good example is something that has, I don't know, in the past several years has become something indie devs talk about a lot, is the idea of owning your own IP and retaining your own IP. And that's become something, it became something some years ago as a marker for a good publisher that has, that is giving you a good deal. And the thing is, publishers adapted to that. And so now the vast majority of them, I think, or at least a large amount of them, will, make clear, oh yes, you own your own IP. We're not taking your IP. The truth is, a good portion of that time, that's just language, and it's hollow. Because getting into sort of like a couple legal terms, there are two ways in which, well, there are multiple ways, but there are two ways relevant to this in which IP can be transferred in some sense. One is a license, the other is an assignment. And what they mean is they're not having you assign your IP. So technically you're the owner, but they are all having you license it. Because a publisher cannot do the job of a publisher unless you license them the IP. The question is how broadly you license it. And I've seen publishing contracts where the license is so broad that it basically applies to everything, including future games. And so you end up in a situation where, yes, technically you still own your IP. You haven't assigned it to anyone. But the publisher's got the right to make the sequel and whatever it wants, or do anything it wants, basically, with the IP. So in what sense do you own it? It's like you own a house, but you've rented it to someone forever. I mean, you don't really own it anymore. So the point is, the words got all right. I mean, the salesmanship responded to the words that indie developers are concerned about, that is, owning the IP. But the substance deviated from it, and in such a way as to honestly be deceptive about what's actually going on. So now, happily, I don't think that's all that. That's at least not one of the things that I think is dominant among publisher contracts, but I have seen it before, and I think it is happening. So you want to watch for that. Just because they say you own your IP, what does that mean? What is the extent of the license, that they're taking? And they do need a license. Don't get me wrong. You can't publish a game without a license that needs to be there. But, make sure that you've got, that doesn't extend to where they can just make the sequel without you, because at that point you don't own the IP.
Yeah, no, that's a great one. And a couple quick points I want to make. So going back to when you mentioned about like they know what type of language, they really understand, indie devs and what's like really good ways to communicate with them. You know how on the show we always talk about, and this is to the listeners, know your audience? Well, guess what? You guys are an audience for publishers. And it's not saying that they're trying to be manipulative or anything like that, but as a publisher, indie devs is their audience. So they're really knowing them. So to the flip side of that, like we've been talking about today with Tim here, is know your audience in this scenario, in this instance. So yes, we talk about players, but when it comes to publishers, know them. So I'm just going back to everything that we've discussed today, is really get to know them, see if everything that they're doing, their track record, what they represent, their portfolio, all those things align with what you're looking for and everything else. And then for the second point, now, Tim, you mentioned a lot of kind of like specific terms and other things that I think for some people here it could get maybe a little bit overwhelming when they're going over these things. So when you do get an agreement, an offer, a contract, whatever, it's probably still advised to definitely seek some type of legal help to review these things so you can have a better and clear understanding of them. Is that a good, safe assumption?
Oh yeah, I mean, I'm not going to consult a lawyer. I will say you should consult a lawyer, but you should also read it until you understand it.
Yeah.
The truth is, these things, a contract is written badly if you can't understand it, and
Good point.
it's you should be able to understand it. Actually, it occurs to me there is a book that I would recommend to indie devs. If they're looking at publishers, because it's the best thing I've seen for sort of explaining what you need to know about publishing contracts and the law around game dev and such. And one of the probably the only thing I trust on that. I wouldn't go to random blogs or anything like that. But it's called Video Game Law. Everything